So, in 1997, David G. Blanchflower and Robert Freeman looked at workers, and they took survey data from the International Social Survey Program, which basically they take surveys every year of a whole bunch of different countries, and it's just basically a huge database of all this information. And during communism, most of these governments wouldn't let the ISSP, or the International Social Security Program, they wouldn't let them take survey data. So there's not a lot of survey data from the actual time period. But what they did was they took data from surveys that were taken just after the fall of communism. So people still are in that communist mindset. They still have the actual title of their work was the Attitudinal Legacy of Communist Labor Relations. They were actually looking at the survey data to try and establish if there was still an attitudinal focus, like if people still had attitudes that were caused by the communist time period. And what they found was that yes, they did. But they also tentatively concluded that most countries under communist rule created an unhappy and unsatisfied population. And this information is backed up by works of biographical fiction that we read in the class, like Waiting for the Dark, Waiting for Light, by Alvin Clement and Joseph Milton Kundera. And in both of those, books, like in The Joke, the main character, Ludwig Jan, he was in a university. He was expulsed from the university because of a joke that was sent in a private message. So he didn't mean to, but he aggravated the party, and the party expulsed him from the party. He was removed from his university, and then because of the law, he had to go into the military. And since he was expulsed from the party, he was put in a separate group of the military, which basically worked in the mines, but that were likely very similar to what Tiffany talked about. And so, if you can't see how that would possibly make someone unhappy, I don't really know where to go from there. But overall, the policies, and in Waiting for the Dark, Waiting for the Light, it shows a lot about how censorship and the suppressive policies would make people unhappy. So, I mean, I can't really connect that much better. So, in the past couple decades, industrial and organizational psychologists have been looking at this idea that maybe happiness is connected to productivity. Maybe in some way, happiness causes people to work better. Being happy causes people to be more productive, or not. The opposite could also be true. So while it hasn't been completely supported by everyone, there's still evidence. While it hasn't been completely accepted by the scientific community, there's still a lot of evidence for it, and one of there's on the source page there's an article that discusses that. But if we're assuming that this is true, though, if we take the information that we do have and we say, if this is true, we have a relationship between happiness and productivity, then an unhappy worker, like we would see in Czechoslovakia during the communist time period, would influence happiness. Or, yeah. So, if we have the unhappy worker in Czechoslovakia, it would affect their productivity. And when you have a lower level of productivity and you apply it to something like manufacturing, then you have, like you would obviously see in the picture, but if you apply it to something like manufacturing, if your worker's not as productive, they're going to produce less. And economists over the years, including Adam Smith, the guy who wrote on the causes of wealth of nations, I forget exactly the title, but The Wealth of Nations. If you haven't heard of it, you should probably look it up. A lot of economists, including Adam Smith, said that they looked at this relationship and they said that on a base level, there is some amount of consumption that is required for general happiness among people. And if there's a lack of goods, then there's going to be lower levels of consumerism and thus a lower level of happiness. So in that regard, productivity influences happiness because you have less goods, and as a result, you have less consumption, and less happiness, because when you look at it and you think about agriculture during this time period, because that's something that the Soviet Union seemed to have a big problem with. Now, not necessarily Czechoslovakia, but because I didn't do research on that. But when you apply it to something like that, and you have basic goods, which are things that are pretty much demanded by society or biological need, like food, shelter, things of that nature, when you have a reduction in those, your base happiness is going to drop tremendously. And even luxuries, they found, do influence happiness, though not as much as the basic needs. So when you have this lower productivity, you have less goods, you have less consumption, you have less happiness. And so it repeats itself. When you have less happiness, you have less productivity and less goods. So it just repeats, and unhappiness builds upon itself until the people aren't happy with the system anymore. And then you get things like the Velvet Revolution.
Okay, so through our collective research, we discovered that not only does communism affect workers, workers also affect communism.
Any questions?
Good.